Michael, for that kind introduction, and thank you for being here. In November last year, SPA asked 1,230 voters this question: do you think Australia needs more people? 38% said yes, 51% said don't know, and 51% said no, and 11% said don't know. But what did they know about Australia's growth? We asked 4 questions to find out. 2 focused on numbers: what is the current population and what proportion of the migrant intake is made up of asylum seekers and refugees. And 2 were in the true-false format and were designed to sort of tap into their understanding of underlying trends. Because of our low birth rates, Australia's population would be shrinking now if it were not for immigration. True or false? So shrinking now is the key bit there. And Australia has one of the highest population growth rates in the developed world. True or false? Well, that's the first one. Correct answers aren't showing up all that frightfully well. In November last year, we were just shy of 24 million. So 54% got that question right. This one's a bit wordier. And that's the correct answer. In that year, it was 6.7% of the intake. 48% got that right. But when you get into the true-false ones, a bit different. Yes. This one's false, and only 37% got that right. True. Somebody here knows the answers. But most of our respondents did not know the answer to that one. 19% got that right. Well, we were really rather surprised to find that people did better on the numbers questions than they did on the true-false ones. But overall, the results of our national demography examination were a little bit disappointing. Only 2% got all 4 questions right. So when we were analysing the results in terms of people who knew something versus people who didn't, we took, if you got 3 questions or more right, you actually knew something. So that gave us 16% of the sample to look at. And knowledge mattered. People who got at least 3 of our questions right were a lot more likely to say, no, I think Australia does not need more people than were the rest of the sample. And so you can see, these were the people who were sceptical about growth. Knowledgeable people led the pack. But young people that we were talking about in the earlier session, young people were right up there. They were pretty ignorant. They were more ignorant than older people, even though they'd just come out of our wonderful education system. But they are also at the pointy end of growth. They're the ones who are trying to get a foothold in the job market, dreaming possibly about owning a house one day and watching that dream shoot away from them. Also, perhaps rather strangely, people who live outside the main cities. And I think the next slide will perhaps help explain that rather counterintuitive result. You would expect people struggling with growth in Melbourne and Sydney to be. Our sample wasn't large enough for us to break the urban data down by which particular cities. It might have been interesting, we could have done that. So maybe next time SPA we get a much bigger sample and do that kind of thing. But anyway, let's look at those who say Australia does need more people. Standout group is people living in Canberra. They were only a small proportion of the sample, but the difference between them and the rest was so extreme it was statistically significant at the 0.01 level. You don't get much better than that. But if you look down the list, migrants, first generation migrants. NES means non-English speaking background and ES is English speaking background. Migrants, first-generation migrants were likely to say that Australia does need more people, but their children weren't. Their children were just like the rest of the sum. And then the tertiary educated. Now, from what Mark was saying about the kinds of nice left liberals that he gets turning up to his permaculture workshops, you can probably get an idea of where these people are coming from. Over the last 30 years or more, when I've been looking at surveys of this kind, university graduates have always shown less scepticism about population growth than the rest. And in many cases, the reasoning goes like this: population growth means immigration. I can't be against immigration because that would make me a selfish racist. So yeah, population growth is good. Now, where do you find migrants and tertiary educated people most? In the major cities. And that's why the results for people living in urban areas were not as sceptical of growth as you might otherwise expect from your own experience of trying to move around. Well, if knowledge made people more sceptical about growth, what were the effects of ignorance? The true-false questions are interesting here, especially the one about Australia's rate of growth. And the next slide I'm going to show you has responses to the question, do you think Australia needs more people, yes or no, by whether they thought, whether they could get the answer right to this: Australia has the fastest growth rate in the developed world. The only two countries that beat us are Luxembourg and Israel. So have a look for the green column here. Oh, it's not showing up very well, is it? It looks fine on my screen here.
Get them to turn the lights down.
Is that possible, Louise?
Or off.
Yeah,
The ones at the front. The lights at the front. And the
That
ones
one
you
there?
turn off.
No, probably. Yeah.
I'm not sure why I just...
I'll read it to you. It's going, of the people who knew that that statement was true, 25% said yes, Australia does need more people, and 64% said no. So that they were much more likely to say no. And of those who mistakenly thought that statement was false, only 47% said no. So knowing that we had a very high growth rate made people a lot more likely to say, no, Australia does not need more people. But not many people knew this, and we do need to think of ways to tell them. Well, if voters don't know much about demography, the same is often true of public figures, including many politicians and serious journalists. Thanks. I don't know whether that helps a lot. Mimo, don't use green again, sorry. Many public figures don't know a lot about demography. For example, on the topic of this alleged natural decrease that we're meant to be suffering from at this very moment, in 2006, Peter Costello said, "Our national fertility rate is less than replacement level. Only immigration is making this country grow." 2010, a Catholic bishop said, "Migration has helped offset the impact of Australia's declining birth rate." In 2011, Stephen Lunn, journalist with The Australian, said, "Australia is still falling short of the replacement level of babies and must continue to rely on immigration to increase its population." So the people who believed this in our survey weren't fools. They'd been told things that weren't true. ABS projections show that assuming a total fertility rate of at least 1.8, if we were to have nil net migration from now on, we would not in fact experience natural decrease until somewhere between 2042 and 2070. Over the last 7 years, the total fertility rate's averaged 1.9, slightly over 1.9. And when that time of slight and minor decrease occurred, it would be after a period of substantial population growth from natural increase alone. Well as hearing that we are suffering from natural decrease at this very moment, we also hear many calls to increase immigration, allegedly to offset demographic ageing. And this is despite the fact that it is well documented that immigration makes only a marginal difference to the age structure of the population, but a considerable difference to the number of people, including the number of older people. And public figures can get muddled with the data, demographic data, or even if they do understand them, can deliberately create muddles. Kevin Rudd was good at this, and in the written version of my paper there's a long example from Rudd. And yes, demographic data can look confusing, but that's because we're not used to hearing about them. But they're no harder than, for example, the GDP figures or figures about unemployment rates. Lots of journalists and politicians and voters can understand these basic economic measures. Demographic data just need to be explained in a simple, unbiased way, and they need to be easy to understand. Well, with all the fog about what's going on, what did voters in November last year think about the effects of population growth? Today, the media let us see that there is concern about traffic congestion and concern about unaffordable housing. Many people have trouble in putting these concerns into the context of deliberate government growth policies. Perhaps the traffic problem is just a question of poor infrastructure, or the housing affordability problem is due to negative gearing. Yes, those factors do matter, but the primary driver underlying them both is population growth. And of course, boat people are always newsworthy. They've had blanket coverage, but as informed people like ourselves know, they make only a marginal difference to the numbers. Well, I'm going to show you what SPA found when we asked people about their reasons for saying Australia does not need more people. These were the top 6 reasons. We offered them 10, and they were allowed to choose 2. So the unit of analysis there is not one person, it is one reason. But you can read that as 21% of people thought that traffic was a problem. Diversity is also up there as a problem, which in earlier surveys of this kind it hasn't been. Concerns about jobs. The natural environment, I'm glad to say, is in the top 5. Unaffordable housing is not as high up as you might expect, but then of course still about 60 to 70% of people either own or are buying their own houses, and for people who've already crossed that barrier, it's maybe not such a concern. Everybody my age is really worried about where their grandchildren are going to live. Yes, so that's what we found about. So this is just the people who said, no, Australia does not need more people, and these are their reasons. Well, what about the people who thought Australia does need more people? What was driving them? It's a lot more clustered there. The argument about the ageing of the population has cut through, but economic growth is one. Primary. Yes, yes. In 2013, the Australian Election Study, just after the September election, asked voters about issues that had been extremely important to them when they were deciding how to vote. It didn't ask about population growth as such, but it did ask about immigration. And it found that this had been a strong concern for nearly half of the respondents. But one could say that when they were deciding how to vote, there weren't very many low-growth options on offer for them. Nevertheless, 45% said that immigration had been extremely important to them when they were deciding how to vote. But of that group, 21% wanted an increase and 55% wanted a decrease, which is kind of similar to the pattern that we found about who wants more growth and who doesn't. Despite this, immigration-fueled population growth doesn't seem to have yet become the burning issue here that it has in the United States and the UK. Yes, Australians are kept in the dark, muddled and confused and don't know what's going on, but so are the voters in the United States and the UK. But in those countries there has been anger about some of the effects of immigration-fuelled growth in some sectors of the electorate. Strong anger. It's been strong enough for fringe politicians such as Nigel Farage and Donald Trump to take the question up and force it onto the mainstream agenda. Now, one reason for this breach in the political elite's defences in these two countries could be the worsening inequality there, including unemployment. This is a problem that has not yet hit Australia to the same degree. I'm not saying Australia is immune, but it's not as bad. What the next slide is going to show is the percentage increase in the average income of the bottom 90% of people in a range of developed countries. This is in decades, from the 1950s through to the 2000s and the first 2 years of the 2010s. Now there's quite a lot of information on this graph and we don't really have to look at it all. We're just interested in Australia, the UK and the United States over the last 12 years. And you can see, this is a graph is taken from publication by Lawrence Summers and Ed Balls that came out last year. You can see that incomes for the bottom 90% in Australia have been rising, whereas in the UK and the United States they've been falling. Indeed, in the United States they've been low or falling since the 1980s. Now, this doesn't mean that Australia has become a more equal society, because this is just talking about the absolute increase of the bottom 90%. If you look at it in terms of income shares in Australia, since the 1980s, the top 1% has nearly doubled its share, and the bottom 90% has lost almost 8% of its share. But in absolute terms, up until the end of 2012, it was still rising for us. What it looks like now that the investment phase of the resources boom is over, I don't know. But, okay. Well, declining real incomes and unemployment can motivate people to attend to the problem of population growth. But why is it so hard for Australian voters to gain access to accurate information? I might kill that slide for the moment, we can have a look at it later if you want to see it again. Why is ignorance on such a fundamental topic so widespread? First of all, keeping quiet about population growth suits powerful business interests, the growth lobby who benefit from it. This in turn means that it suits those politicians who depend on them for donations and favourable media coverage. It can also please the discourse police. These are moralists who think that suppressing what they think is the ever-present threat of racism is more important than national welfare. Beyond this, de facto political bipartisanship on population growth is a fine way to make sure the topic is not publicly discussed. Open political debate brings information into the light. The absence of such debate feeds silence and ignorance. People know about the GDP and unemployment rates because politicians openly compete on keeping GDP high and unemployment rates low. They don't openly compete on keeping the numbers of migrants high. Indeed, they both agree tacitly that they should be kept high, and they both know that the general public is not so keen, so maybe it might be a smart idea not to talk about it. Australians will be most unlikely to vote for the party that promised to bring in more migrants than the opposition. So, bipartisanship on immigration-fuelled population growth helps keep the blanket of silence in place. And should bipartisanship seem to weaken, as it seemed to do a bit in 2012 and early 2013 with debate over the 457 visas, an important part of the temporary migration intake, the growth lobby can always borrow some lines from the discourse police in order to quell it. For example, in March 2013, Ines Willox from the AI group said, "The debate is giving an unwelcome platform to xenophobes and zealots opposed to immigration in any form. And Steve Knott from the Mines and Metals Association also condemned the shrill xenophobic rhetoric that's going on around the place at the moment. And an editorial in The Australian summed it all up by complaining that Labor's short-term agenda was to demonise foreign workers with a xenophobic advertising campaign run by the CFMEU. Mr Rudd should reject this nonsense and speak the truth about the virtues of the 457 visas. It may not yet be a big Australia, but it is better. Well, a policy of keeping quiet about the extent of growth and its effects suits the self-interests of the growth lobby. These are the forces of darkness that keep mainstream politicians wedded to bipartisanship, growth and silence. And silence also suits those moralists who like to keep unacceptable topics under wraps. But there's also the force of what Gary Freeman calls rational ignorance. The growth lobby makes money out of population growth, and the rest of us bear the costs. There are only a few of them, so it's in their interests to fight hard to keep the numbers coming. There are lots of us, and for each individual the daily rise in costs is small. So not many Australians are strongly motivated to push against the tide. Added to this, unbiased information about demography is hard to find. The ABS publishes it, but voters would need knowledge and persistence to use this information to discern the underlying trends. And the ABS, of course, is silent on the political forces behind these trends. So usable demographic information is hard to come by. And any interest in it by lay people may be suspect. They could be carriers of some distasteful phobia, or worse, not the kind of people you want to invite round to your place. In these circumstances, it can be rational for most people to choose to stay ignorant. Why bother? It's hard to find out the information, and trying too hard to do so could have unfortunate social consequences. In the 19th century, the forces behind silence on sex and reproduction were patriarchy and the church. Today, the forces behind silence on Australia's population growth are the growth lobby and bipartisanship, together with the discourse police, sometimes all working in combination. There's a need for a steady source of information that voters can understand. Maybe there's a role here for SPA. Why leave the field to burn its salt?
Thank you very much for that, Kathy, and it's great to have the survey put into words and your opinion on it too. So, yeah, were there 3 quick questions, and where's Jill with the... So we've got 1, 2, 3. First, the gentleman, oh, sorry.
Kathy, on that slide where you had 90th, bottom 90th percent, is it percentile or percent?
No, the bottom 90% in terms of income.
Right, so the majority of the population.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Got one in the middle there.
I think I can. Thanks. Hi, Kathy. Just for the practically minded, perhaps Sustainable Australia people here, you mentioned what's the best way of perhaps lifting the blanket of silence of the bipartisan, lot that we've got on population growth, immigration, what have you, exposing it to the general public in this upcoming election?
Wow, I don't know about in the election.
Well,
yes.
In the lead up to the election, obviously.
Look, if I were to have a dream realised about this stuff, it would be to have an interactive population dashboard where people could go, they could see what the numbers are now, what the total fertility rate is, with a brief explanation what that means, what life expectancy is, what net overseas migration is. Again, I think just keep to those 3 variables. And then they could see what it will be like in 20 years, 30 years' time, according to certain to the kinds of assumptions the ABS projection uses. With someone with the right computer skills, you know, I've already got the data on my computer that could be plugged in. What would be really nifty if they could play around with it? And what would it be like if we reduced the total fertility rate to 1.6, and if life expectancy did X, and if the rate of migration did Y, so that school children could play around with it? Now that would need some clever programming behind the scenes. But I don't know how expensive it would be. But
Sorry.
The demography department of the ANU has this programme already.
exactly as I say it.
Very well, no. What it does the population pyramid. You can play around with the population pyramid.
Can you change the variables?
Well, you could 5 years ago. I don't know what's happened.
I'll have a
since
look at
then.
it. I'll have a look
Well, I
at
don't know
it.
if it's published either.
Sorry?
I don't know if it's published either. The copyright, if you like, or whatever. Oh, what's the name? The assistant for Peter MacDonald,
Okay.
who's
yes.
now working in the States.
Well, I will certainly go and have a look. It hasn't come to...
I know it's not on general release.
Well, I'm thinking of something general release that school children working on assignments would be able to go to. And the ABS data would all be there in a way that was easy to find. And I know from teaching, because I've taught this material for years, you'd say to the students, you know, it's all on the ABS website, just have a look for it. And they'd come back, oh. Yes.
Now we've got one more question from the front, I think. Mark.
I think Kathy's just answered my question, actually.
Oh.
How Katharine SPA increase the public's awareness of basic
Well, I think that's probably what I would have said. Incidentally, if you go to carryingcapacity.com.au, there is an interactive dashboard there. I think it's a little bit out of date, and I don't know that it's being maintained, but you can say, you know, how many people could Australia hold, you know, if we all went vegan, if we all did this, that and the other, and we stopped exporting food. So that I like that.
There's one more here, which we'll go to quickly, and then there's time at the end.
Piece of good news which needs to be shouted from the rooftops. After years of promoting or covering up overpopulation, The Age, under new editor Mark Forbes, has actually tackled the subject of population.
Josh Gordon, yes, he's terrific.
That was just so good
Yes.
after all their years of cover-up.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Right, thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you.